So I can tell you my experience and my memory of the first kind of the opening chapter of this movement, which to me is still kind of the most interesting part, because that was the part that really took all of us by surprise. Right? On Public Affair, the WORT community radio noontime call-in show that airs on weekdays in Madison. Even just that week before the movement came into being, there was the usual kind of calling in and look at what's going on here, or look at what's going on there. When is this going to happen in the U.S.? What is it going to take? Blah 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 blah. You know, like kind of a usual kind of hand-wringing kind of thing. I was in New York for a conference that week of February 11th. That's the day I always go back to. Visiting some friends in the morning of February 11th. And we were sitting there talking, visiting, and they had Al Jazeera streaming in the background, projected on their wall, with Tahrir Square going nuts, right? It's because Omar Suleiman had announced the departure of Mubarak only hours before then. Later that day, same day, right, as the celebrations were going deep into the night in Egypt, I was getting emails from people back home and from progressive groups, from friends, saying, look at what Walker's doing. This was his announcement. This was a coordinated assault. Television ads supporting his, just announced and just unveiled budget repair bill have been airing across the state. What is going on? And he by the way, he's already threatened to call out the National Guard should there be any paper disruption. So there was a kind of temporal contiguity there that really cannot be erased from the event, that I think is really interesting to keep in mind. Of course, they're entirely not comparable contexts, but nonetheless, because in time there was this kind of proximity in time, there was this interesting sort of linkage that became useful in the first few days of the Wisconsin actions in terms of the movement understanding itself. Okay, that's just something that I kind of go back to and think about a lot. What I write about in the piece that I co-authored with Nicolas Lampert, that's important to emphasize here, that's also related to that first part, is how those first events, that first week of events, first 10 days of events unfolded. Because they unfolded very quickly and things were developing every day, or more than a big event in a day. So into this narrative of what was happening was unfolding in hours, not days or weeks. And that, I think, is very interesting from a kind of movement analysis perspective to keep in mind, because it meant that there was no time for debates about, like, well, is this a more effective thing to do, or should we engage in this kind of politics because it's somehow, Like, there was no time for these kinds of ideological arguments about what to do. People just did things that they were organized enough to do, and the responses from the conservative side, from Walker's office, had to be met, right? So there was this kind of interesting, the way I talk about it in that text is this chain of events, a chain of escalation, as it turned out. And I think that's, when we look at things like out there, a poster that says General Strike, for me, the lesson of this movement is that poster is almost meaningless without the chain of escalation, and you can't really I mean, there's so many factors that go into setting off that chain of escalation that that's very difficult to predict. We can prepare for it as much as we can, but when it's actually happening, we just have to be able to recognize it. Is all. So, anyways, there's that thought. Then I'll just end here by saying that as an observer, and I wasn't an active organizer in any of this. I was just a person going down to demonstrations and writing about it and trying to analyze it as it was happening, so we had some sort of picture of it later on. What interested me most and continues to interest me most is just the contradictions in this movement, because in terms of like having this movement be a kind of model for remaking labor politics and progressive activism and really involved grassroots activism, I think it's important to somehow wrap our heads around all of these contradictions and know that we have to be able to be effective politically without resolving these contradictions. So a couple of the really big ones is that this was a Wisconsin movement, right? This was something that because it had to do with these attacks that happened from the office of the governor and within the bounds of Wisconsin laws, legislation, regulations, etc. Like those were all the vehicles for these attacks. We were, this movement is automatically kind of bound to the confines of state politics in some very important ways that cannot be avoided, right? And that, I think, is, we have to understand that when we get down to working for this movement, a lot of the energy and resources necessarily are going to be channeled into that arena, even though we know that all of this kind of thing on the image level and on the mediated kind of communication level is going to resonate and hopefully inspire movements and grassroots activism in other places, in other contexts, right? So there's this kind of limitation to the arena we're operating in, but at the same time, everybody else can see what we're doing, right? So we are communicating outside of that, right? So that's an interesting contradiction. Another one is that this whole entire thing is really a rearguard action. I mean, nothing would have happened. There would never have been this movement had there not have been these attacks. And the response to all of it, the prevailing response, and the response that has been most effective in building a popular mass movement, have all been on the level of taking the position of conceding everything except our most fundamental rights, right? Like the collective bargaining rights, the rights to assemble, even things like that. And where does that leave the visionary element, right? The constructive, positive element, the world we want to see. How do we within a movement that's defined by this kind of defensive rearguard kind of posture, how do we advance some sort of vision, a positive vision of a world that is way beyond Scott Walker, right? That Scott Walker's not a part of, right? So how do we get that out there? And that's another